I'm really excited because I just received the mysterious AutoFlex Shaft. What's happening, Panda Nation? Peter Von Panda here. I'm really excited about this. Korean hidden technology, kind of like me. And this AutoFlex Shaft is kind of the unicorn right now. You have probably seen the other videos. TXG has done quite a few videos demonstrating the AutoFlex Shaft. Man, I have so many thoughts on this as I have been waiting on this shaft, and thanks to the USPS for completely losing my first shaft. This is actually the second one I ordered and it just came. I have some theories on why this is doing what it's doing, and I'm going to, as a bogey golfer, try the shaft out. Now, I'm not really a bogey golfer. I'm more of like a 25 handicap. For people like me, I think we are interested in what will people who actually really struggle with getting the timing of the swing down, you know, that release perfect. I think guys like Matty Boy are really good at, no matter what they're swinging, to get that head square to the ball, you know, get the maximum club head speed right at impact, and he's probably a lot better than the rest of us. And so it's a little hard to know when you take a 1 or 2 handicapper, scratch golfer, and demo something like this. So I am absolutely your below average recreational golfer, and we will see what this does. Now, a couple things that I have checked out here. It's actually pretty nice looking. You get a little bit of iridescent green up here and down here, and they also make this in a rainbow color, and I thought maybe just this portion that's in hot pink would be in the rainbow, but it's actually rainbow all the way down, so I went ahead and got the hot pink one. I don't like the hot pink. There's a part of me that wants to just take a can of black Krylon and spray over this, but it's funny because this is such gold at the moment that I wonder if having a shaft with a hot pink band in the middle will get just about everyone's attention, because I wonder how many average golfers are aware of the mysterious AutoFlex Shaft. Now, when we get to testing this, I'm going to test it compared to a number of other shafts that I have for my PXG driver. You can see I have a PXG adapter on the base there. But then we are going to cut this thing open and see what's inside and compare it to what's inside a normal graphite shaft and see if we can notice any differences. Now, one of the things that I want to do here before we test anything is just take a look at the shaft and its characteristics that are obvious to me as I compare it to my other shaft. Now, here I have my PXG driver and I have a bunch of other shafts. So first of all, I just want to show you comparison-wise flexibility. This is the hazardous smoke. It's an extra stiff shaft, and if I just kind of give it a little bend right there, it does not bend much. I can see it deflecting just a little bit. I currently have installed on my driver a regular flex shaft, and if I just give this a little bend, you can see that maybe deflecting even a little more. It's a little easier, maybe even a little easier with the head on there to do it, but you can see that. And I will also be comparing it to this. This is an A-flex shaft, and it's very light. It's a 40-gram shaft, and if I go ahead and flex this one, you know, it doesn't really feel all that much more flexible than the regular, but pretty flexible. Obviously, I can get it to deflect just a little bit there. Versus the AutoFlex. So if I take this and just give it a flex, you can see it flexes quite a bit more, just even under a little hand power there, right? And so you can see that deflection probably better. Now, what I did notice is this is a 60-gram shaft, and it's also uncut here. And what I want to show you is that when you look at these side by side, you can actually see that the wall of the AutoFlex shaft appears to be about half as thick as the hazardous smoke shaft. You would assume that a stiffer shaft would have more material, and you would be right. Some of them, when you get down to the tip, are almost completely filled up with graphite, and you would expect it to be half as heavy and half as stiff, you know, or maybe even less. And I would say that seems to be about right. It is quite light, and especially if you are going to trim this at the butt end to your particular length, you're going to lose a little weight on it, and so that's going to be pretty normal. I did notice that in the instructions it says never to tip it, so do not remove from the tip end here. Now, hopefully I read that right, but my guess then is that all that flexing happens down here, and if you tip it, you are probably going to lose a little bit of that. Now, when I first saw this, I actually had some thoughts on what might be happening here, and I know some people talked about non-Newtonian materials and stuff like that, and I'm not a scientist, but it's my understanding that non-Newtonian materials are materials that exhibit the properties of materials in different states. So a non-Newtonian material might exhibit the properties of a liquid and a solid, and a couple of materials that I think are non-Newtonian in certain circumstances are things like slime and cornstarch in water. And if you think about slime, kind of the heavier slime, you can actually like pour it and it'll start rolling out. But if you catch it while it's pouring and cut it with a pair of scissors, it'll actually cut cleanly. And that's exhibiting the properties of both a liquid as it's pouring out, but a solid as you cut it. And the same thing for cornstarch. If you've ever seen cornstarch mixed with water, it will stick to your hands. It kind of looks like pancake batter, but if you slap it, it gets rigid, and you can actually walk on top of it as long as you slap it with your feet. So it exhibits the properties of water or liquid when you put your hand in it and it sticks to you, and also properties of solids. When you hit it and impact it, it turns into a solid. So one of the things that people were thinking, and probably maybe no one was thinking of it, maybe I was just thinking of it, is that they just fill the bottom end of this with cornstarch. Now, I don't think you can do that. And then I was thinking, well, maybe they use just like cornstarch in the material. They sprinkle a little in and you get the behavior of a non-Newtonian material. I don't think that's what's happening with this anymore. Now, these shafts are only available in Korea. They are very expensive, but people are finding a way to get them. And so I am finding these on eBay and online. And for people like me, at least in the testing that I've seen, people are picking up 5 miles an hour more on their clubhead speed. Now, that's really important because I've been working on clubhead speed for a while, and it's just really hard. You know, when you kind of plateau at a certain speed, for me it's about 78, 80 miles an hour, and part of that is because I play with shorter shafts and I'm a shorter guy. Once you start really figuring out what your natural clubhead speed is, it's hard to get that up without a lot of work. And a lot of guys work very diligently on it, and that's something I've been working on all summer long. And you just have kind of diminishing returns as you work on that. Now, what I love is the idea that you might be able to get like 5 miles per hour more by doing really nothing else, just changing the hardware. And so for $800 or $900 a shaft, is that worth it to you? Well, for some people it can be. You know, 5 miles an hour more can be like 5, 10, 15, 20 yards for some people, depending on how far you're actually hitting it in your clubhead speed. So I definitely think it's worth it. And for a lot of guys that are in the more money than brains club, you know, something like this is a no-brainer. You know, they will go after this just because they have the money and they want to be more competitive on the golf course, or they want to enjoy it more. You know, there are guys that spend thousands of dollars on a golf club. Now, what's funny to me is how expensive this whole experiment will be. So my PXG head, which is like a $600 head, on an $800 shaft, is suddenly like a $1,400 golf club retail-wise. Now, I would not do this if it weren't for you guys and to share my experiences as a below average golfer with you. So what I am going to do now is I'm going to go to the simulator and try out my driver on these various shafts and see what kind of consistency I can get and distance I can get, and then also try it with the AutoFlex shaft and see if this provides me any noticeable gains. Then what we're going to do is we're going to cut this open and sacrifice it and figure out what's going on. See if there's anything obvious to us on how it's constructed. They do talk about in the description that it's like this proprietary weave, right? And so maybe they are weaving the fibers in here in such a way that there's like no torque, so that even though it's really, really thin, the head isn't opening or closing like it might on a really flexible standard graphite shaft. I'm not sure if we'll be able to see that, but I will cut this open as well as a standard graphite shaft, and we'll just take a look at them and see if we can notice any differences. Honestly, I do not expect to cut this open and see non-Newtonian materials just oozing out of it. I really think that it's just simply a situation where a really flexible shaft forces you into becoming a better golfer. Because when they say Korean hidden technologies and that they haven't filed a patent for this, I think it's primarily because there might not be anything really patentable about it. It's just the amount of graphite they're using or the amount of fibers that they're using. They might just be kind of following the model of a fishing rod, but putting it into a golf club shaft. So I actually suspect, Occam's razor here, that there's really nothing special about this except unthinking the way we think about going to stiffer shafts with faster clubhead speeds. So before we hit the simulator, one thing I want to do here is just kind of demonstrate the Waggle test, because I think that's something that everyone is familiar with. And even though the shaft feels softer, it's not really until you put it into the club that you kind of really start to see how differently it behaves. And so I have it in here. I will tell you that my club head weight is set to a D2, so it's a little bit heavy. And so I just want to show you the waggle test here versus the other ones. And it's really, to me, kind of the bottom foot that it seems to really do something differently. Now, it's probably hard to see how much it's waggling, even compared to some of the other shafts. It doesn't necessarily come across on video like, wow, that's really dramatically more flexible. In fact, it's really not until you waggle it in front of someone else when you are on a tee box or playing golf with someone else that they're really surprised. Like, they can see the head really move pretty dramatically, again, down by the tip itself. And it's more dramatic than other clubs. Now, the other thing I was actually surprised with here is how much flex the regular shaft has. I wasn't surprised that the AutoFlex had it, but to be honest, between the regular flex and the A shaft, I really couldn't see a lot of difference there. And so I definitely think the regular flex is probably my ideal flex, and it's probably giving me a little bit extra boost with that shaft flex. On the other hand, the extra stiff really does not have much flex in it, especially under the waggle test, which isn't really moving or loading the club up much. So no surprise there. But what you might be able to see here is that the AutoFlex definitely has more flex than the other ones. And I was trying to do my best to be consistent about how much I was waggling them. All right, guys, time to find out what this shaft can really do. I'm here at the simulator. I've got my sheet here to take all of my notes and to write down all my data points. So I've got my head here on my regular shaft. So this is the shaft that I have played with a lot, and it's just the one that's really supposed to be ideal for my swing speed. So I thought I would warm up with this. Now, I will say, and my disclaimer is that I am not Matty Boy, and it probably is going to take me a while to get a decent group of shots. So my guess actually is that I will probably, between the regular, the extra stiff, the AutoFlex, and then the AutoFlex, I'll probably be in like 130, 140 swings. So I'll probably be a little pooped after this. But it's kind of what it's going to take to figure out exactly what I'm getting on average and then my maximum. All right, guys, so I spent a couple hours at the simulator, and I have some results, and I'll be honest, I'm not entirely sure what to make of them, except that there are some pretty stark differences. So what I also want to do here is remind you that I am not a good golfer, so I had to take a lot of shots. I'm going to roll in some footage just so that you can see that I was kind of tracking what the results were as I was hitting shots, and then I went ahead and averaged all the shots per each shaft at the end and looked at those results. There's two other things that I want to mention here is that I trim my shafts about 5 inches. So I play with one length clubs, that includes my driver. And so I have trimmed the butt end of this shaft to match my regular shaft so that everything is absolutely the same. And then I took an extra stiff shaft and that AutoFlex shaft, and they are all exactly the same length. So I just want to show you that otherwise everything is exactly the same. So these are all replacement shafts for this PXG head. They are all exactly the same length, which makes this a pretty easy and I think pretty fair test. Now, the other thing that I want to say here too is that to get my swing weight up, I've added additional weight to the head here, and that's why I really like this PXG head, because I can add more weight. Right now, it's a D2. Now, I will say that some of these shafts are slightly different weights. This AutoFlex shaft is actually the lightest at about 45 grams, and the extra stiff is actually the heaviest at about 65 grams. So there is a little bit of difference there, and I did not adjust the head weight to accommodate those differences. I think one of the issues here, especially with the whippy shaft, is that you have to have a certain amount of weight here to get that whip effect. So I think the AutoFlex company recommends that you use a D1 or D2 weight on the head. So kind of keep that in mind. Now, let me back up here, and I'm going to start with the two shafts that I would not normally play, starting with this AutoFlex. So this is an AutoFlex shaft. It is a Riptide AutoFlex shaft, and I would not normally play this because it usually would be too whippy and a little bit chaotic. So what I did here is I put this on and hit a bunch of shots, and my average club head speed was 73.5 miles an hour. That's kind of important because that's actually the average club head speed for all three of these stock shafts. Ball speed on the 73.5 club head speed was 108.5, and the carry with this was 147 yards, and the total distance was 171. Now, keep in mind that this is a pretty short shaft, but 171 is shorter than I will normally play. We'll compare that to the regular shaft here in a minute. But the dispersion on this was 13.1 yards. So the dispersion was actually pretty fine, right in line with what I would normally play, but it was definitely a little bit shorter, which actually surprised me a little bit because of the whippiness. I thought maybe I'd get a little bit of AutoFlex effect, and maybe this would fly a little bit better, but there's no wonder that I don't play this one. Now, I would not normally play an extra stiff shaft either because my club head speed just isn't there, and so I don't think I get the benefit of a stiff shaft or an extra stiff shaft. And my club head speed was 73.5 miles an hour, which was just about the same as with the AutoFlex, which actually surprised me. I was surprised it wasn't a little lower because this really does not flex very much, so it's not giving you that extra mile or two with kind of the whippiness of it. My ball speed was 109.8. For whatever reason, the ball speed was a little higher. Now, the issue here is that the carry was just a smidge shorter. You could call it probably even 145.1 yards. I think the difference there is that you're getting slightly different dynamic lofts when the shaft isn't moving. And my total distance on this was 167.8 yards. Again, dispersion, 13 yards. So the dispersion stayed about the same, and the actual effect, whether I was going more flexible with the AutoFlex than I usually would do, or stiffer with the extra stiff than I would usually do, kind of seemed it was about the same with either. Now, the regular shaft is basically what I've always played here. I feel pretty good with this. I will also say that this is the shaft that I've played with the most because I played with it all year long. Club head speed was 73.7 miles per hour, which is just a hair faster than the other two, but effectively the same speed. Ball speed was the fastest off of this one with 113 miles an hour. Now that might be because I just have used this a lot. I can get the timing down, and with a little bit of flex and a little bit of whip to it, you get that release down, more efficient with it or whatever it might be. But carry was 160.3 and total distance was 181.7. Now I would say that in the real world, when I have measured my shots on the golf course, they seem to be slightly longer, but in the simulator, I just use the standard golf balls. I'm not using, say, the low compression balls that I will usually use. But between this shaft and the AutoFlex or the extra stiff, this shaft seems to give me about 10 more yards. This is definitely the shaft that I want to use. Now, I will say dispersion is slightly higher at about 16.2 yards, so it definitely sprays a little bit more, 3 yards, and that might be a combination of me feeling more comfortable with it, swinging maybe just a hair harder, maybe getting that little extra distance, but also kind of getting a little more dispersion, a little more wild with it. But either way, this has been pretty good to me, and usually I'm pretty consistent, pretty decent with this shaft. Now, again, I'm giving you real numbers here. These aren't numbers to be proud of because as a 20 or 24 handicapper, I just am not a long player, and that's kind of sad, and I really want extra distance, which is why I picked up the AutoFlex to see if I could get some free distance out of it. Now, here is where I am pretty confused, because what I would expect is if this works, if I see more distance on the simulator, if it's going farther, carrying farther, rolling farther, I would expect to see more club head speed, more ball speed, all of that stuff. And because of the smash factor, I was hitting it or kind of off-center toe, you know, right where I hit it with everything else. The smash factor was just about the same, but clubhead speed did go up, but not a ton, but maybe right in line with what you'd expect. So 73.5 miles an hour is pretty much what I was swinging with every shaft out there. Now, on average, I was swinging the AutoFlex, or at least getting the head to swing at 79.2. So that's like a 6 mile per hour improvement. And I thought, all right, there's an issue here because there's a head and heart issue for me. The head issue is I can't really imagine this working correctly, but my heart really wants it to. I really want to believe that I can just buy some extra distance and extra speed. So I feel a little bit like there's a subconscious desire to want to make this work. That being said, I film myself a lot, and I was looking at the slow motion swings, and I really don't see any difference between me swinging this. I didn't really feel like I was trying any harder, especially because this was the last one I hit. I was a little fatigued, starting to sweat. You know, I was already over 100 swings with the other shafts, so I definitely don't think that this shaft got my best effort. But nonetheless, 6 miles per hour more is nothing to sneeze at. Again, ball speed coming off here was 119.6 on average, which over my regular flex is also 6 miles an hour faster. I would imagine that that could be anywhere from 6 to 10 miles an hour faster just based on my extra clubhead speed, but 6 miles an hour faster is pretty good. What surprises me is how much distance that equated to, and I really have a tough time believing that this is correct. So my average carry was 174.9, and my average total distance with this is 201.5. Now, remember, this shaft I have lots of practice with. I have used it a lot. I actually really like it. It's been pretty good to me. But at 181.7 average total distance, which is about right, you know, I can kind of press that to the high 190s or 200 sometimes when I really am clicking. But to average 201, to average basically the outer range of this one, really surprised me. And then the last piece, which just kind of baffles me, is that the average dispersion on the AutoFlex was 11.6 yards. So it's less than the regular. So not only am I swinging this faster, getting more clubhead speed, bombing it longer, roll it a little further, it's also more accurate, which I will say is not out of line with what I have seen from other people online. Now, again, I'm trying to wrap my head around why this is working, and I definitely have my theory on what this is doing. So, before I share that with you, well, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think we are all dying to know what is inside an AutoFlex shaft. So I'm about to cut it open and see what we can see. So I cut up the shaft here, and I am hoping that you appreciate that, because I think we are all dying to know what's inside. As I took a look at the shaft, one of the things that we noticed right away was that the walls on the shaft seem to be about half as thick as they are on any other graphite shaft. So I grabbed a regular graphite shaft. This one is actually by Matrix. It's a standard regular flex graphite shaft, and I cut it and then cut that piece open here, and then here is the AutoFlex shaft. Now, I don't see a lot of difference here. I'm going to give you some close-in look here, and maybe someone will notice something that's important. I think the weave might be a little unique to them, but basically when I'm looking at the Matrix shaft here, what you can see here is that it looks actually very smooth. You can see maybe just a little bit of the weave, you know, but it almost looks like crushed carbon fiber to me. You can see a little bit of that, you know, a little bit of that texture, but I think because it is thicker, you kind of lose the detail in it, but it looks pretty smooth. Because it's not painted or anything, I think that if you were to take a coat of paint, it would probably look just about as smooth as the outside of the shaft, right? So this side of the shaft you can see there. And it almost looks like the way that it's woven is that it's kind of lateral, almost like it's wrapped, almost like it's a coil of rope or something like that. But, you know, inside I don't think reveals anything. Now, if I take the AutoFlex shaft here and we look at this side, I still have that same kind of coiled reflection on the outside there, so that's not a big difference. But on the inside, and I think this might be just because it's thinner, you definitely see more of the texture inside here. And so what I am seeing here generally is an angled kind of weave to it. It might not be that easy to see, but basically what I can see here is that we have some weaves that look like they're going 45 degrees down here, and then almost another weave that goes 45 degrees down there too. Now, I don't know if that's standard for graphite shafts, and we can just see it here just because it's very thin, and so the texture stands out a little bit more, but it definitely seems to look more like that, and maybe that is unique to this, and maybe that's what gives it kind of the flexibility as well as that rebound effect. But otherwise, there's nothing really inside of here that screams to me that there's any sort of technology built into this other than it being pretty thin. All right, so we have looked at the shafts. I have shown you that this is a very flexible shaft. I have taken it to the simulator. I have hit probably 30 shots with this and 30 shots with the other shafts here, and I have pretty good results to show that I am definitely hitting this further. And here is what I think it does, and I kind of mentioned this. I think this shaft just whips. And because of that extra flexibility, I think you are forced into getting your release correct. Because if your hands are ahead, the head just feels way behind, and if your release is too early, the head feels way too ahead of the ball. And so I think it just forces you into a nice rhythmic swing and forces you into a release to get to that club square and that shaft straight at impact. To talk about that whippiness, I actually found a video of, I think, Korean workers that put sledgehammer heads on like these really whippy shafts, and supposedly that's an improvement over using like a wooden handle on it, because you get all this club head speed and you can maximize the impact by kind of whipping it around and getting that max hammerhead speed right at the point of impact. And I think that's what this is forcing you to do. It's just forcing you, because you feel that head dragging behind you on your downswing, that you have really good perception of where that is, and after a few hits you start really dialing that in to get it to kind of pendulum down right on the ball. So I think it's really just the whippiness of this. Unfortunately, I don't have a super high speed camera, but I was taking some slow-mo shots, and to me, even when I was a little off on some of these slow-mo shots, I just noticed that that shaft looked pretty straight at impact, even when I felt like I was a little ahead or behind the ball. And in fact, what never really happened, which can happen with some of my shots, is that I get a really dramatic slice. You know, it looks like an L. It kind of feels like it just takes off left. And even on some of my mishits, they really just kind of curved and went left or right. They didn't really have those kind of hard cuts that I will have with my regular shaft sometimes. So for whatever reason, this seems to square up pretty quickly. So I think that besides being really flexible, this shaft has a tendency to recover, or almost like return to its straight state very quickly. So not only is it bendable, you know, and you can take a rubber hose and it's very bendable, but it doesn't necessarily want to return to its original shape. So I think this has a really good combination of being flexible, but also having this tendency to try to return to its original shape. So do I want to play with this? I will tell you what, I absolutely do. And I am absolutely going to keep the shaft in here for now, because I just felt like the results were kind of easy to get and they were pretty noticeable. In fact, I played a simulator round of golf with some of my friends afterwards, and they were talking about me bombing it much longer than I normally do. And again, I don't feel like I was trying, but I feel like you get a lot of kick down here. Now, a couple of adjustments that I made after swinging some of my initial shots. I have lowered the loft on this -2 degrees from where I was. So generally I would play with a 10-degree loft here because of my slow swing speed and I'm trying to get the ball up. But as I was hitting those first shots, I was hitting like 20-degree launch angles. And what I realized here is that I needed to bring this down. So I lowered it a degree, and then I lowered it 2 degrees, and that seemed to kind of get me in the high teens, because I think it just has a tendency to maybe kick and give you more loft at impact or something like that, because I just was launching them high, and I think I can actually eke a little more speed out of this and a little more distance. The other thing I will say is that this is the SF 405. And I wanted to get this because it was kind of the middle of the road, hopefully the Goldilocks shaft, and I think that this is probably the right shaft for most people. But because of my swing speed, I'm actually kind of tempted to try the SF 305, which is designed for guys that swing slower like me. Now, my problem with that is if it's a $60 or $70 or $80 shaft, no problem, I'd order that 305 and just try it out and compare it. If it were a $300 shaft, I tell you what, I'm so impressed with the results so far, I would try to pick it up too. But at $600, $700, $800, it's not something that I just want to experiment with. So maybe if I can get my hands on a 305 shaft, I would try that versus the 405 for my swing speed. But so far, I'm really happy with this. And again, I'm just not sure what to make of these numbers because it didn't really seem like there were dramatic improvements across the board, but yet the cumulative effect, and the only thing I really care about is the total distance, definitely seems to be markedly improved. And I think that any graphite shaft company right now should probably be experimenting with a shaft that I don't really think has any specific cutting edge technology in it. I have a feeling it might just be as simple as making the sidewalls here half as thick as they are in a normal shaft. And it might just be adding flexibility to the shaft. It might be unthinking or rethinking everything we've thought about shaft flex up to this point. So if I were any of the other standard OEM companies, I might be experimenting with these and seeing if I could duplicate the same results, because a shaft with less material on it might be cheaper to make, could be a $40 or $50 shaft, and yet give you all sorts of additional benefits, especially for us as average golfers. So if I were working for a company, I'd be experimenting with this right away, because if that's the case and there's no real hidden technology in here, it's going to be really easy to duplicate. And I think AutoFlex is smart for pricing this at $800 to try to capture as much money as they can, because everyone else will come in here, copy this, no patent on it, and build the same exact shaft, and then kind of that advantage is dried up. So it's probably smart for AutoFlex to try to milk as much out of this as they possibly can right now, because next year there might be a lot of shafts that do the same thing from OEMs. So would I recommend this? Absolutely, regardless of the price, right? But with the price, I get that that does not make a lot of sense for a lot of people. The shaft alone in this price point is probably more than most people spend on their entire set of clubs. And will it totally change your game? No, I don't think so. But for some of us who are working on release and timing and maybe can't turn or muscle or move or maneuver the way we used to in our youth, it's potentially an easy way to get more yardage. And for me, it's basically almost 20 yards to the better, which is kind of crazy. So, hey, I am definitely confused on this, but I am super glad I picked it up. If you want to pick one up, they aren't that easy to find, but they are starting to pop up more and more. I'll put a link to some in the description below where I can find them. Peter from Panda, out. For a regular flex shaft, and if I just kind of give this a little